So ladies, listen to a man disclosing the secrets of our female brain. Please.
All right. Thank you very much, Gabi, for introducing me. Thank you for inviting me here and for you all listening to a talk of actually a zoologist, because one thing Gabi Miketa didn't mention is that I'm also the head of a zoological institute, but let's keep that aside for the moment. The topic of my talk is, and actually it's put as with a question mark, but I think we can leave that after a while. The female brain, lighter but smarter, remarks from a neuroscientist. So I will talk about differences in brain structure, about cognitive skills and emotion and emotional control, the different usage of modern media and how that affects our brains, especially in a gender-specific way, a little bit about gender and disease aspects. I find a very important topic, and last of all, and not least of all, boys in school. I do have 2 boys myself, so I know what I'm talking about. But I cannot spare you a little history, actually embarrassing history, by one of the most famous neuroscientists. It's Paul Broca. He's so famous that at least that one of the main language areas is named after him. He worked in the 19th century in Paris, and he was also the first one who started to look in sex differences in the brain. And what he found was that, yes, indeed, if you looked at 280 male brains, they were larger than the males of females. Not so surprising if you consider body size, but his conclusions were quite different. He said the 16% difference in brain size is due to the following. Well, we could ask ourselves if the smaller brain weight of females is due to the small size of her body in comparison to the average man. But we should not forget that women are on the average less intelligent as men, a difference we should not overestimate. How nice of him. But it exists. I mention it because, of course, you all have heard many stupid remarks from males about females, but this is a famous neurologist, and I have another very famous social psychiatrist, Le Bon. He's the founder of social psychiatry. He actually concluded from that the female size is close to that of a gorilla, which, by the way, is also of course, wrong. What they all didn't know at that time is shortly after, Alfred Binet, indeed, was the first one to develop actually IQ tests. And when he did that, he wanted to have a measurement of how smart school children are, actually to protect them and from the vulnerability to teachers. And it took him 3 years to adjust the intelligent quotient, the intelligent mark for boys, to that of the level of the females, who always scored higher. That, of course, was quite a surprise, and you have to think about that this was a time when it was decided, can females actually study? Can they go to university? And at that time, it came at a huge surprise that they actually did much better in intelligent tests than the boys did. And as I said, it took him 3 years to do that because it was supposed, the IQ was supposed to be something of the average of the whole population. And he had just too many verbal language-related questions in his tests. I cannot spare Le Bon, the one with the gorilla remark, with the following test. I'm not sure if you can see that correctly, but I will do my best. What you will see in this movie, this is a female chimpanzee, and he will compete against a male student. By the following test, this is just a pre-test, will she be able to learn the numbers from 8 to 9? You will see no problem, she learned that, and she earns her breakfast by doing that. And then comes the real test. It's kind of a memory test where this little chimpanzee lady, just 2 years old, has to memorize all the numbers she sees just for 250 milliseconds, and then she has to tip on them correctly, and you can see how this competition between a chimpanzee and a student goes. But let's first here have a look, so you can see this easily she can do. So much about math and females, no problem. You can see here. She's earning her breakfast, so I mean she doesn't do it out of free will. But she can easily do it, and of course, students can do it as quick and as good as well. So no problem here. But now comes the real test. First, you see the male student. You see the numbers just once, very quickly. So this one was correct. And now the second. And now you will see that he does them all wrong, and that's why the movie stops. And you can see it's very hard, but the student here had many weeks of training actually to learn to see the numbers that quickly, but he can just simply not memorize all numbers in that short time period. That's why you hear this little strange beep there. This was the last round. So the students actually make 30% of that test correctly, and now we look at our 2-year-old chimpanzee female. She has to do the same test, the same amount of time allocated of doing that. And you can see here how easily she earns a little amount of breakfast as a dessert. And just to rub it into the male students, you can actually see how relaxed she is. She's looking around. She says, well, you know, boy, I can do that all day, and I will always beat you. Of course, this is just a joke between males and the animal kingdom, and you see these comparisons is just of historical news. There's another historical remark. This comes out of intuition. Betty Davis was once asked, because she was always claiming women are actually smarter than male, and this 30 years ago was quite a thing. And she said one reason she gave is, of course, I believe that. Or did you ever see a woman who runs after a man just for his legs? It's kind of funny that Betty Davis actually said that. But I can also not spare you to actually come back to all this measurement thing of size and brain weight. And indeed, with modern methods, indeed, it still holds that human males have on the average a larger brain than females, even if you adjust that to body size, which actually Broca should have done as well. But now comes the surprising thing. Okay, male brains are heavier, but the gray matter in the brain, you can see here the outer side, this is the gray matter. This is where the cell body of neurons are. This actually has a higher percentage of the whole human brain than the rest. That means the density of neurons is just higher. And there are more neurons per volume in a female brain. And if you start counting neurons, you come up with the same number of neurons in the male and in the female brain. It's even more devastating for the males, because one of the reasons why the volumes of the male brain is larger is because the liquor, this is water, sorry. The water in the brain, this is in ventricles, this is to protect the brain if it is hit, for example, by a soccer ball in ancient times, I don't know what it was. So this is to protect the brain, and this liquor, this water in the brain has just more volume. So you can make the conclusion yourself about the bigger brains of males, because they have simply more water in their brains. And of course, it's basically a male business to be obsessed by size. Another thing that came into it, okay, the number of neurons is equal, and this is a computational unit. This is a computational unit in our brain. This is what counts. On top of it, what counts is, and we have recently discovered that there are 10 times as many glial cells in our brains than we have actually neurons. And as a result, what came out of it is, if you start counting them, you find more of these glial cells in the female brain. And one thing that's happening there is that the myelination of axons, shown in blue in here, or you can also see it here. This is the isolation actually of the output part of a neuron. That's the axon. That's where electrical activity is transported to other brain areas. And these areas are better protected in the female brain. And that means the speed of processing and the precision of processing is probably better. Another interesting thing is it's not just size, it's how much space is allocated to certain brain areas which are then related to certain tasks. Let me, for example, start here with the prefrontal cortex. This is really the part in the foremost part of our head. This is our executive, this is the CAO of our brain, where we control emotion, where we make future plannings, where our logic thinking is located, where we make all the decisions, where our personality is located. And this part of the brain, in comparison to the rest, is larger in females in comparison to males, which is probably one of the reasons why, if you look at emotional control, females on the average are better than males. Males have an advantage in all other aspects of the frontal lobe. That's a part of the cerebral cortex. And in this case, it's a part that's mainly related to motor coordination, motor planning, like throwing a ball and these kind of things. Here the males have an advantage. There are two other areas which are also related to emotion. The names don't count here, but it's a very big structure in the middle of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex. Both are also related together with the prefrontal cortex, not only to control your own emotion, but also to perceive emotions in other people. For example, this is the foundation of empathy. Then we have actually one brain area that's in comparison bigger in the male brain. It's the amygdala. That's one of the areas where emotion come into the brain. And if it is not controlled by the prefrontal cortex, it might actually take over. For example, the amygdala orchestrates aggressive behavior, where also males are more prone to do that in comparison to females. Then you find other interesting things. The hippocampus is a brain area related to detailed memories, to autobiographical memories, and to long-term memories. And this actually, by comparison, is also larger in the female brain. So by concluding this, over the past decades, neuroscientists have documented an astonishing area of structural, chemical, and functional variations in the male and the female brain. And one of the things I was just talking about emotion, emotional control, and empathy. There's one important thing that is located in the structures that are larger in comparison to males, so that are larger in the female brains. These are the structures that we need for empathy. And empathy is just not only to feel sorry for somebody. Empathy is actually a lot more. Empathy means I can deduce what other people think and feel. So for communication, it's extremely important to talk to each other, to actually know what other people think and feel. And in order to do that, we humans have a special type of neurons. It's called mirror neurons. So whenever we observe something, let's take, because it's the easiest, the motor behavior. If we observe a motor behavior in other people, and you would record the neuronal activity in the brain of the observer, you see the same neuronal activity. And since these neurons have been found, they have been found everywhere. For example, they are important for copy learning. Already early on, kids can do that. It's even a part of learning that works between genders sometimes. And it's important to actually feel for somebody. If I show you this picture, so far it's harmless. If I show you the real version, you see? I don't show it any longer. So what happens? Here you see a brain scan, not of your brain, but of people who perceived the same that you perceived, so that just saw other people having pain and not having pain. And these results were compared to people who actually had pain. Don't ask me who voluntarily volunteered for this kind of study, but some people actually did. And what came out of it is that the people who perceived pain showed the same activity of emotion areas than the one who had actually pain. The only difference is the thumb and the toe, where obviously we don't have any pain when we observe it, but the pain-related areas are the same, and this is all mediated by these mirror neurons, and they are partly in brain areas that are larger in the female brain. It has another twist to it. Communication is approximately 75% non-verbal. So it's not only words that count, there's actually more the face, the way we say things, even some kinds of smelling or body gesture, everything counts into it. And this is all analyzed by the prefrontal cortex, which is in comparison to other animals in the human brain, the largest part actually of our brain, and even larger in the female brain. And in order to accept somebody as a role model, we have to accept, or let's put it that way, we have to accept somebody as a role model, to accept to learn from him. We are copy learning, Nachahmungslernen. And we are actually the best species on this planet who can learn. We are copy learning. So nachäffen, to say it in German, so like monkey business, it's not actually the real thing. We are much better in copy learning than all chimpanzees on this planet all together, but only if we accept somebody as a role model, which means we can adjust to him, we can hook up to him. So teaching and mentoring is therefore a lot more than didactic skills. It means the person, and probably also the gender of the persons, are as important as his didactic skills. So much about role models and mirror neurons. We have other aspects where the female brain is different. We have probably very often heard about it, and it's indeed true. We have a data transfer system between the two big hemispheres of the brain. Here's the left side, here's the right side, and we have a data transfer between the two of them. And this data transfer is just better in the female brain, which is extremely important, for example, for language, which is not only done on the left side of the brain, where you have important brain areas, but also the right side of the brain is as important for language skills. And if you have more connections between the two sides, you can better coordinate your verbal skills. And on top of it, when it comes to multitasking, if you have two hemispheres that are better connected to each other in terms of language, you are actually better in multitasking. But, and here comes a bit but, very often I give a talk like this one about learning and so on, and there's always this claim that the female brain is actually better in multitasking because this is a perception that the females have about themselves. First of all, we are all equally bad in multitasking. So if you are a manager who is doing 5 things at a time, keep thinking about it, you are not as efficient a person who does one thing after the other. But indeed, whenever it comes to language, the female brain, women are better than the male people. And that's, I think, why this perception, especially from situations at home where you talk to somebody and then your husband is doing something and cannot adequately cope to what you are telling him. So this is definitely a problem, but keep in mind, if you take all things in mind, if you have 4 projects you need to process in parallel, males and females are equally bad, there's no gender that has an advantage. There's another thing where multitasking comes into play in our modern time, computer usage. Usually when we do that, we do 3 or 4 things at the same time. We work on a project, we look for our emails, we probably look at Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. And if we do that, our phone might ring, somebody might come in, and so on. And especially when it comes to media usage, women use computers differently than males do, so they use more of social networks where males are doing more of the playing business. And this, especially for the males, has certain disadvantages. For example, it's the wrong attention training. Attention is mediated in the prefrontal cortex again, where in comparison the female brain has an advantage. For them it's easier to focus on one topic on a long time, which also for the schools is a huge advantage for the females. The reward system is wrongly calibrated if you do too much multitasking and also if you do too much computer playing. Cognitive processes are more prone to error because if you do many things at the same time, you don't do them in depth, so you're more error prone. Then comes a special problem for the male brain if you work a lot on the computer. And this is nothing against computer work. Of course, we all need modern media, we need computers, but if you do that, especially as a young kid, for 6, 8, or 9 hours, you lose in your motor skills. For the females, it's not that much of a problem. First of all, they don't do that for 9 hours a day. Second of all, if they start school, they're much better in fine motor control and fine motor skills than the young boys are. Second problem, especially for the young boys, is language skills are not as much trained as it is necessary. Also here, at 6 years old, already the male brain has a disadvantage in terms of language when it comes in comparison to the girls that enter schools. Simply, the girls use more different words, they understand more words already at the age of 6 years. It's not true, by the way, if I would be allowed to make that remark, that males use less words a day, so they speak as much as the females do, but the humans use between 20 and 10,000 to 20,000 different words. The females are closer to the 20,000, the males are closer to the 10,000. But if you count the number of individual words, they are the same. Another problem, also a huge problem for the male brain, is if you work too much on a computer, you actually lose on social competence because you do something with a machine which you, instead of playing with other kids. It's also less of a problem for the female brain because in the last 3 aspects mentioned here, they start with an advantage anyway, so they can cope with problems in these areas more easily, but for the male brain, this is a huge problem. Another thing I would like to mention, to find differences in brain structure is one thing. To say if this is nature or nurture is another thing. also learning has a huge part into it, as you can see here. Here, medical students had to learn for their physicum. It's a very big exam. They learn for 6 months just facts about the human body. And you can see here, one of the structures important for learning of facts is the hippocampus I mentioned earlier. And indeed, due to learning, this area actually grows during the whole learning period for the whole time. So if we find structural differences in the brain, they can be partly genetic, and there's good indication for it, but it can also be partly training. So to sum it all up, in our days, it's not a matter of asking, are there differences in our brains, but are these differences in the 21st century an advantage for the female brain? And the psychiatrist Laurent Brissendine, in her book, The Female Brain, and let me quote from that, summed it up like that: the female brain has tremendous unique talents, outstanding verbal agility, the ability to connect more easily in a new social context, so social skills, a greater capacity to read faces and a tone of voice for emotion and the states of other people's mind, and the ability to diffuse conflicts is better developed in the female brain. All of this is hardwired into our brains, also into the brains of women, and these are the talents women are born with that many men, frankly, are not. And a neuroscientist also, woman said, well, thanks God, I'm a woman. That was her conclusion to that. There are actually more areas where these differences in gender-specific aspects of the brain actually matter. So these inequalities are not just interesting features that might explain why more men or women enjoy a certain TV soap, or why men and women park a car in a different way, all this kind you very often read in the media. It's actually important because it raises the possibility that we might need to develop sex-specific treatments for a host of conditions, including learning disorders, depression, addiction, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress orders, where we find differences in the occurrence in the male and in the females, and researchers need to take that into account for their studies. For example, if they study drugs, usually if there's an animal model, it will only be tested in the male animal model because you don't have an estrous cycle and it makes life easier for a scientist. But that's, of course, not how pharmacology should be done in these days. Just to provide that with a few arguments, for example, depression is twice as often in females as in males in every culture where you look at. And you see here one difference is in brain chemistry shown with the PET scan, where you see that serotonin, one of the important neurotransmitters for our mood control, is actually a lot faster activated in the male brain as in the female brain. And it's interesting now to study if this is in any way related to the fact that more females are under depression than in comparison to males. On the opposite, if it comes to chronic stress disorders, you see that the male brain is a lot more damaged. You see it here by the size of the error of the damaged area in comparison to a rather small area in the female brain. So here the male brain reacts in a much more difficult way, which means if you take all these disorders together, you actually feel like the male is a fragile gender. You see learning deficits 4-to-1, hyperactivity syndromes 4-to-1, autism, Asperger syndrome, impulsive aggression. On the other hand, there are also diseases which are have a higher frequency in females. I've just now listed here the neurologically related, the brain-related diseases or deficits or syndromes, and you see here their gender-specific aspects. Let me also make one other remark. What I've said so far are statistical difference between hundreds and thousands of participants in a study. The question you can ask is, in terms of school, can I put, for example, the boys in terms of language learning in one class and the girls in another class? You could do that, but if you look at an individual girl or an individual boy, it's not enough to know it's a boy or girl to know how he will do his achievements in school. I've highlighted that here. For most categories we can look at, 85% of both genders are in an overlapping area, and they're just here, as you see, some outliners that makes then a statistical difference, but this statistical difference is just for a few of these people. So come to a quotation of Samuel Johnson, who was asked about his opinion of men or women are more intelligent. The real answer is which man and which woman. But if we make politics, we have to take into account, for example, for the school system, that they behave in a different way. Another problem is our perception. Small differences that are probably indeed due to different aspects of our brain structure, we kind of overestimate when we see them, we overgeneralize them. Here you see one aspect from our visual system. You might all have the perception that this bar is lighter here and darker here because there's a different background. If that takes the background away, you see actually it's one bar. That's how our brain works. We usually sharpen our vision and our thinking by overestimating differences, and we have to keep that also in mind. Other aspects we have to keep in mind is that for many categories we can measure, we see outliers by the males in the high achievers and in the low achievers. So there's some hope here that we also have some really intelligent male, and we should really try to keep them here. Other hopes. Let me give you a cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes, where he as a male, Calvin as a male, had a question. Well, you have a question, Calvin. Oh, yes. What assurance do I have that this education is adequately preparing me for the 21st century? So say me for a male. Well, am I getting the skills I need to effectively compare in a tough global economy? I want a high-paying job when I get out of here. I want opportunity. This is what the boys are crying now, and if you look at the PISA results in Germany, you see some hope. In here you see, starting from the first PISA session, the males, the boys, actually improved during each testing quite a bit, and partly due to the fact there's actually now really training starting in the first classes for all the boys that have language problems. But the cartoon goes unfortunately on, because Mrs. What's her name? Wormwood actually said, in that case, young man, I suggest you start working harder. What you get out of school depends on what you put into it. Well, then is the response. And here comes now the real picture, because I showed you only the boys. This is the achievement of the girls in the same test, so you see the differences, how huge they are in school, and from the language training the boys got, the girls even profited more than the boys. One thing you might consider is there might certain things that boys can actually do, probably even better than the females, for example, being inventors, probably not very skilled in communication, but working around, playing with tools is one thing, and probably they need the right incentive, and I know you're all watching the soccer game tomorrow, so I couldn't resist in putting this in here. Probably you would have solved this math problem if you put it into the right perspective, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So what can we do for our sons?
One thing is let them be sons. They are loud, they are aggressive to each other. Just teach them what aggressiveness is okay, which are not. And take into account that the male brain develops slower than the female brain. So if you have a 7-year-old girl, it's actually a year older than a 7-year-old boy. So in order to be fair to him, one has to take that into account and really let them play around. Like, for example, for me it was always hell. I had to sit in the first class for hours and hours. I was not allowed to run around, which was a real disaster for me.
Last question probably, which is interesting for us here. Does the female brain age better than the male brain?
Yes, it does.
Okay, that's
so
a
you
good
start,
message, isn't it? It's a good message.
So you start earlier, and the female brain is better protected against aging than the male brain.
Yeah, that's what we all wanted to hear. Thank you.